You didn't become an adult early because you wanted to. You became one because the adults around you needed you to. Maybe a parent got sick. Maybe money disappeared. Maybe someone left and never came back. Whatever the reason, childhood ended not with a ceremony, but with a quiet, unspoken expectation that you would simply know what to do next. And you did. You learned to read faces before words, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to carry weight you couldn't name. But that's not the part of the story people misunderstand. You grew up inside a system that had no manual. There were rules, but they were never written down. There were expectations, but they were communicated through silence, through a look, through the sudden stiffness in someone's shoulders when you asked the wrong question at the wrong time. You learned that certain topics made the room smaller, that certain moods required you to become invisible, that your needs were valid only after everyone else's were met. This wasn't cruelty in the traditional sense. It was survival architecture. The adults in your life were often doing their best with broken blueprints, managing their own unprocessed histories while trying to raise you. But the effect was the same. You learned to observe, to adjust, to preemptively solve problems that hadn't been assigned to you. You became fluent in a language most children never have to speak, the language of emotional logistics. By the time you were 8, 9, 10 years old, you could walk into a room and know within seconds what version of yourself was required. The caretaker, the mediator, the one who didn't need anything. You learned to collapse your personality into whatever shape the moment demanded, not because you were manipulative, but because adaptability was the price of stability. And stability, even fragile stability, felt like oxygen. This created a strange double consciousness. On the surface, you were a child, going to school, playing games, doing homework. But underneath, you were running parallel software, constantly monitoring, assessing, adjusting. You were the emotional IT department of your household, troubleshooting crises in real time while everyone else assumed the system was working fine. What made this particularly disorienting was that no one ever told you this was happening. There was no moment when an adult sat you down and said, "I need you to grow up faster than you should." Instead, it happened through accumulation. 100 small moments where your feelings were deferred. 1,000 instances where you learned that your job was to make things easier, not harder. The framework was invisible, but it was everywhere. It was in the way you learned to cry silently, in the way you stopped asking for help, in the way you became excellent at reading what people needed before they knew themselves. And because it was invisible, you couldn't resist it. You couldn't even see it clearly enough to name it. You just knew that something inside you was different from the other kids, something you couldn't quite explain. They seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by information they shouldn't have. You learned early that knowledge has weight, and once you know certain things about the fragility of the adults around you, you can't unknow them. The strangest part? From the outside, you often looked fine, maybe even impressive, responsible, mature. Teachers liked you. Other parents praised you. So well-behaved, they'd say. So helpful. And you'd smile because that's what you did. But inside, you were tired in a way that children shouldn't understand yet. You didn't notice it then, because it was normal. Risk wasn't something you sought out. It was something you were placed inside, repeatedly until your nervous system learned to function within it. Not physical danger, necessarily, though sometimes that too, but emotional exposure. High-stakes situations where failure had real consequences, and no one was coming to buffer the impact. Maybe you were responsible for a younger sibling while your parent worked double shifts. Maybe you had to navigate an adult's mood disorder, learning to de-escalate situations that could turn volatile without warning. Maybe you were the translator, literally or figuratively, between worlds that didn't speak the same language. Whatever the specifics, you were given responsibility without authority, accountability without resources, and expected to perform. This created a peculiar kind of competence. You learned to make decisions in real time with incomplete information. You learned that hesitation could be costly. You learned to trust your assessment of situations because there was often no one else to ask, or asking revealed that the adults knew less than you'd hoped. So you developed what psychologists call an internal locus of control, the belief that outcomes depend primarily on your own actions, not external factors. But this came with a shadow side. Because when everything depends on you, failure isn't just disappointing. It's catastrophic. You learn to be hypervigilant, to run scenario planning in your head constantly, to never fully relax because relaxation meant letting your guard down, and letting your guard down meant someone might get hurt. The stakes were real and you knew it. What made this sustainable was repetition. The same challenges over and over until your nervous system adapted. Until panic became focus. Until fear became data. You learned to metabolize stress differently than your peers, to function in states of activation that would overwhelm others. Not because you were stronger, but because you had more practice. You were being conditioned systematically and without consent to operate in crisis mode as a baseline. The consequences were immediate and tangible. If you didn't manage the situation correctly, you saw the fallout. Someone cried. Someone yelled. Someone didn't eat. Someone didn't come home. Cause and effect were ruthlessly clear, and you were inside the causal chain. This wasn't abstract learning, it was visceral. Your body remembered these lessons in a way that classroom education could never replicate. And because the exposure was controlled not by safety, but by the limits of the situation itself, you never got the experience of full catastrophe. Things were always bad enough to hurt, but rarely bad enough to fully collapse. You lived in that middle zone, where the system was perpetually strained but never quite broke. And that taught you something dangerous. That you could endure more than you should have to. That your capacity for suffering was elastic. That you could keep going long after comfort disappeared. No one celebrated this. No one gave you a medal for surviving your own childhood. It just became part of your operating system, quietly running in the background, shaping every decision you'd make for decades. And that conditioning mattered later. Disappointment came often, and it came without ceremony. Plans changed. Promises evaporated. Things you'd been excited about simply didn't happen, and you learned that your excitement was not a binding contract with the universe. Christmas might be smaller than expected. The birthday party might get canceled. The person who was supposed to show up might not. But the more important lesson wasn't about disappointment itself. It was about what happened afterward, when no one came to help you process it. There was no therapeutic debriefing, no gentle conversation about feelings. You were sad or angry or confused, and then life continued. Dinner still needed to be made. Homework still needed to be done. The world didn't pause for your emotional weather. So you learned something that many adults still haven't mastered. Emotions are temporary. They arrive, they peak, they fade. You don't have to do anything about them. You don't have to perform them for an audience. You don't have to wait for external validation before moving forward. You can feel terrible and still function. You can be heartbroken and still show up. The feeling and the action exist in separate channels. This created a strange kind of emotional self-sufficiency. You rarely sought comfort because you'd learned that comfort was unreliable. You developed the ability to self-soothe, not through healthy coping mechanisms necessarily, but through sheer habituation. You got good at sitting with discomfort, at waiting for the feeling to pass, at continuing anyway. Embarrassment worked the same way. When you made mistakes, and you made plenty because you were still a child learning adult-sized lessons, there was often no one to soften the impact. You said the wrong thing, wore the wrong clothes, misunderstood the social code, and the consequence was immediate social feedback. But instead of someone helping you process the shame, you just absorbed it, integrated it, learned from it, filed it away under things not to do again. Rejection, too, became data rather than devastation. When you reached out and got nothing back, when you tried and failed, when you were excluded or overlooked, it hurt. But the hurt didn't destroy you because there was no one standing by to confirm that it should destroy you. No one was watching your reaction, waiting to see if you'd break. So you didn't. You just recalibrated and moved on. What you didn't realize at the time was that you were developing a psychological immune system. Just as your body learns to fight off infections through exposure, your psyche was learning to metabolize emotional injuries without external intervention. This made you resilient, yes, but it also made you isolated. Because resilience built in isolation teaches you that needing people is a design flaw, not a feature of being human. You learned to celebrate your own victories silently, because no one else was tracking them. You learned to comfort yourself in defeat because no one else was available. You learned that your internal experience was yours alone to manage, and that self-regulation wasn't a skill, it was a survival requirement. And for a while, this worked. You were proud of how little you needed, how independent you were, how well you could manage without support. You thought this was strength. But self-control isn't enough when the world itself destabilizes. The moment wasn't dramatic. There was no explosion, no single event you could point to. Instead, it was a slow-motion realization that the adults who were supposed to have answers didn't. That the systems you'd been told were stable were actually improvised. That the confidence you'd seen in authority figures was sometimes just a performance covering confusion and fear. Maybe it was watching a parent lose their job and not know what to do next. Maybe it was seeing a teacher break down. Maybe it was a national crisis, economic, political, environmental, that made it clear the grown-ups were as lost as everyone else. Maybe it was something more personal, a revelation about family history that recontextualized everything you thought you knew. Whatever it was, you saw behind the curtain. And once you see, you can't unsee. This is different from simple disillusionment. Disillusionment is when reality fails to meet your expectations. This was deeper. This was the recognition that the expectations themselves were built on sand. That the narrative you'd been given about how the world works was incomplete at best, constructed at worst. That the map bore only passing resemblance to the territory. For most children, this realization comes gradually, buffered by time and development. But for you, it came early and all at once. And it came at a moment when you were still depending on those same adults for survival, which created a terrible paradox. You knew they were fallible, but you still needed them. You saw their limitations, but you couldn't afford to fully acknowledge them because that would mean accepting how precarious everything actually was. So you learned to hold two truths simultaneously. The adults in your life were doing their best, and their best wasn't enough. The systems were real, and they were fragile. You could trust people, and you couldn't fully rely on them. This double vision became permanent, a split screen you could never turn off. What died in that moment wasn't innocence in the fairy tale sense. It was something more specific, the belief that someone else was in charge, that there was a master plan, that the world was being managed by competent hands. You realized earlier than you should have that everyone is making it up as they go, that authority is mostly just proximity to power plus confidence, that the grown-ups were once children too, and many of them never actually grew up, they just got older and better at pretending. This transferred the burden of certainty from external structures to your internal compass. If the authorities couldn't be trusted to know the right path, then you'd have to develop your own navigation system. You started questioning everything, not from rebellion, but from necessity. You became skeptical of simple explanations, wary of promises, allergic to blind trust. This made you harder to manipulate, but it also made you harder to comfort. Because comfort often requires surrender, and surrender requires trust, and trust requires belief in something beyond yourself. And that belief had been damaged at a structural level. That was the moment innocence actually ended. What came next wasn't resolution. It was duration. A long stretch of time, months, sometimes years, where things were wrong but not destroyed. Where you could see the problems clearly but couldn't fix them. Where fear became ambient, a background hum you learned to function through rather than eliminate. The divorce proceedings that dragged on forever. The illness with no clear prognosis. The financial instability that meant every month was uncertain. The family secret everyone knew but no one discussed. The slow-motion disaster you could see coming but couldn't prevent. Whatever it was, it didn't end quickly. It just continued. This taught you something most adults only learn later, if at all, how to function without closure. How to live in the gap between problem and solution. How to maintain routines when the foundation is crumbling. How to keep showing up when there's no guarantee that showing up matters. You learned that survival isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just repetition. Wake up, go to school, do homework, pretend everything is normal, go to bed, repeat. The endurance wasn't physical, it was psychological. The constant weight of unresolved tension. The mental energy required to hold space for multiple possible futures simultaneously. the exhaustion of never knowing which version of events would materialize. Other kids lived in a more linear time. They experienced problems and solutions in relatively quick succession. But you lived in loop time, where the same fears recycled endlessly without resolution. You learned to make peace with ambiguity, not because you were wise, but because you had no choice. Certainty simply wasn't available. This created a strange relationship with hope. You couldn't afford to be fully hopeful, because hope makes disappointment sharper. But you couldn't afford to be fully hopeless either, because hopelessness made the present unbearable. So you learned to exist in a narrow band between the two, a pragmatic, day-to-day focus that didn't extend too far into the future. You stopped making long-term plans. You stopped assuming continuity. You learned to hold everything lightly, because anything could change without warning. This made you adaptable, but it also made you reluctant to invest deeply in anything. Why build when the ground might shift? Why attach when loss is always possible? The strange thing about prolonged uncertainty is that it doesn't feel traumatic while it's happening. Trauma is acute, sharp, memorable. This was chronic, dull, forgettable. You didn't have flashbacks to specific moments. You had a general sense that childhood was heavy in ways you couldn't quite articulate. It was the water you swam in, so constant you stopped noticing it was there. Years later, when people would ask about your childhood, you'd struggle to explain. It wasn't abusive. It wasn't neglectful. It was just a lot. And a lot doesn't make for easy storytelling. There's no villain, no rescue, just a kid carrying weight and learning to walk normally anyway. Most people mistake this for trauma. The word resilient gets thrown around too easily. It suggests bouncing back, springing forward, overcoming. But that's not what happened to you. You didn't bounce, you absorbed. You didn't overcome, you integrated. What you built wasn't resilience in the inspirational poster sense. It was something more specific and less celebrated. Adaptive capacity. Adaptive capacity is the ability to modify your responses based on environmental demands, to shift strategies when circumstances change, to function across a wide range of conditions without breaking. It's not optimism, it's flexibility. It's not toughness, it's malleability. You learn to be water, not stone. This shows up in strange ways. You're unusually calm in crises because crisis is familiar territory. You're good at triage, assessing what matters most and acting accordingly. You can switch contexts quickly, moving from one role to another without much transition time. You waste little energy on things you can't control because you learned early to distinguish between effort and impact. But adaptive capacity has a shadow, can make you shapeless. When you're always adjusting to fit the situation, you can lose track of what you actually want when no one else's needs are in the equation. When you're always reading the room, you forget to check in with yourself. When you're always managing, you forget how to just be. The strength people see in you, the competence, the reliability, the unflappable nature isn't really strength. It's continuation. It's the result of a nervous system that learned to keep running long after comfort disappeared. And while that served you well in childhood, it becomes complicated in adulthood when you're supposed to have choices. Because continuation doesn't require choosing. It just requires not stopping. You're probably good at your job, whatever it is, especially if it involves problem-solving under pressure. You're probably the person people call in emergencies. You're probably the one who stays calm when everyone else is panicking. And you've probably wondered why these situations feel easier than they should, why you seem to operate better under stress than in peace. It's because stress is familiar. It's your first language. Calm is what you learned later and you never became fluent. So you unconsciously create or seek out situations that match your internal calibration. Not because you enjoy suffering, but because it feels like coming home. Your baseline was set early, and everything since has been referenced against it. This isn't a flaw, but it's also not purely an asset. It's an adaptation that made sense in context and now persists outside of it. You developed a specialized skill set for an environment that may no longer exist. And the question isn't whether that skill set is good or bad. It's whether it still serves you or whether you're serving it. The identity that formed around these experiences is real. You are capable. You can handle more than most people. You do have unusual psychological endurance. But those truths exist alongside another one. You shouldn't have had to develop those capacities so early. Both things are true. You're allowed to be proud of who you became and sad about what it cost. You're allowed to use the skills you developed and also wish you'd learned them differently. You don't think about your childhood often, not in explicit narrative form, but it shapes everything. The way you handle conflict, the way you interpret silence, the way you assess new relationships, always looking for the catch, the instability, the hidden cost, the way you pride yourself on needing very little and then feel strange when someone offers freely anyway. People who grew up differently often don't understand why you operate the way you do, why you won't ask for help until you're drowning, why you seem distant even when you're present, why you're so good in a crisis and so uncomfortable at a party, why you can handle almost anything except being taken care of. They think you're cold or guarded or overly independent. They don't see that these aren't choices. They're echoes of a time when those strategies kept everything from falling apart. The truth is, you integrated your childhood rather than transcending it. It's not something you moved past. It's something you built with. Every coping mechanism that helped you survive became part of your architecture. Some of those mechanisms still serve you well. Others have become limitations you're just now recognizing. And that's normal. That's what happens when you develop survival strategies before you develop choice. You didn't escape it. You integrated it. And the person you are now, the capable, perceptive, steady one who everyone relies on, exists because a child once had to become someone they weren't ready to be. That child is still in there, not wounded necessarily, but watching. Making sure you never get caught unprepared again. Making sure you never need what might not come. That's not nostalgia. That's calibration.